People ask me what it was like, having one of them on the farm. They want the dramatic version. They want the part where I grabbed a rifle and stood in the doorway with fire in my eyes. They want to hear about explosions, or some clever trick I pulled that saved the day and sent the hunters packing back to wherever cold and lightless place they came from. I tell them the truth, which is less exciting and more true than anything they could imagine. I was mucking out the lower barn when I found him. It was early autumn, the sky that particular shade of gray that sits over the eastern flatlands like a lid on a pot, the kind of sky that doesn't threaten rain so much as it simply denies the existence of sun. My hands were already bad that morning. I dropped my mug twice at breakfast, which meant the neural cascade was in one of its moods, which meant I'd be fighting my own fingers all day. I'd learned not to fight it head-on. I'd learned to work around it, work slower, work angrier, work anyway. The farm had been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather had broken the original land, back when this part of the colony was still being parceled out to settlers willing to scratch a living from frost-hard soil. My mother had nearly lost it twice, once to bad harvests, once to a trade agreement that undercut local grain prices for 11 years running. I'd inherited both the farm and the debt, and the knowledge that nobody was coming to help. So you learned to be your own help, or you became somebody else's story about failure. I was 34 years old. The diagnosis had come 8 months earlier. The specialist at the colony medical station had explained what was happening to my nervous system in the careful, gentle way that specialists use when they've decided the person across the desk is fragile. I'd listened, asked 3 practical questions, and driven the 4 hours home alone. I didn't cry until I was through the gate and the farm was around me, and even then I wasn't sure if I was crying from grief or from fury, and I've never been entirely certain it matters. MS, in layman's terms, means your own immune system loses its mind and starts attacking the insulation on your nerve fibers. The signals that run your body start to break down. Some days are fine. Some days your hands don't work properly, or your vision blurs at the edges, or your legs go numb from the knee down and you're walking on borrowed sensation. Some days all 3 at once, and you learn which walls are good to put your shoulder against when the floor starts lying to you about which way is level. My farmhand Piotr had left 3 weeks before I found the stranger. He'd given me a week's notice and a careful, apologetic speech about family obligations. He was a good worker, honest, no trouble, and I'd known for a month that he was thinking about going. I didn't blame him. Working for a woman who was visibly deteriorating, on a farm that was surviving rather than thriving, in a region of the colony that the capital had been quietly deprioritizing for years. There were better prospects elsewhere. I paid him what I owed him, shook his hand, and went back to work. Norman, who farmed the adjacent land, had offered to help. Norman was in his 60s, had been farming since before I was born, and had opinions about everything, and was usually right about most of them. He'd offered in the way old men of that generation offer help gruffly, with the clear implication that he expected the offer to be refused, and was prepared to respect me for refusing it. I'd refused it. He'd nodded as though I'd confirmed something he'd already known. We'd been carrying on like that for 34 years. His wife Agatha brought me food occasionally, wrapped in cloth, left on the gate post, no note. I ate it and left the cloth folded neatly on the same post. We never discussed it. That was the terms of the arrangement. So I was alone on the farm, except for the animals, except for the daily business of survival, when I went into the lower barn to muck it out and found a man lying in the straw behind the feed bins. He was on his back, arms loose at his sides, eyes open. For one terrible second I thought he was dead. Then his chest moved. I stood there with a shovel in my hand and my heart doing something complicated, and I said something, I don't remember what, probably something eloquent like "what the hell," and he turned his head and looked at me. His eyes were dark, not dramatically dark, not alien film dark, just a deep brown that caught the gray light from the barn door and held it. He was youngish, maybe late 20s, maybe older, it was hard to say. He was wearing clothes that looked like they'd been bought on this colony but hadn't been designed for it, wrong weight for the climate, wrong cut for farm country. One sleeve was torn. There was dried blood on the side of his neck, not a lot, but enough. I said, "Can you hear me?" He watched me. I said, "Can you speak?" He watched me. I pulled up my sleeve and touched the medical patch on my forearm, the one that monitored my vitals and could send an emergency signal to the colony station 12 kilometers away. I hadn't used it yet, in 8 months of living alone with a degenerative condition. I stood there with my thumb over the contact point, and I looked at this man in my barn, and I made a decision that I've thought about many times since. I didn't press it. I crouched down beside him instead, which my knees complained about, and I looked at the blood on his neck, and I said, "I'm going to assume you're not dangerous unless you give me a reason to think otherwise. Nod if you understand me." He nodded. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" He considered this. Then he spread one hand carefully, palm up, in a gesture that I interpreted as, "somewhat." "All right," I said, "can you stand?" He could, though it cost him. I got him into the house. His name, his real name, I never learned. I don't think he had one in any sense I'd recognize. I called him the Traveler because I needed to call him something and because that's what he was. He never argued with it. He never argued with anything because he didn't speak, not in any language I had access to, not with his voice at all. He communicated in gestures and expressions, and a quality of attention that I came to read over the following weeks, the way you read weather, not through individual signs but through a pattern of them, a pressure in the air, a shift in the light. I cleaned the wound on his neck. It wasn't a cut. It was a mark, circular, faintly geometric, the kind of thing that doesn't happen by accident. Something had been removed from him, or something had been applied to him, and the process had left a signature. I dressed it without asking questions. He sat very still while I worked, which told me either that he was accustomed to being worked on or that he was in more pain than he was showing, and movement would have made it worse. I suspected the latter. I fed him. He ate carefully, watching each item of food as if cataloging it. He didn't eat like someone who was unfamiliar with the act of eating, but like someone who was slightly surprised by the specific texture of things, the temperature, the smell. Like someone eating with a new set of senses than the ones they were used to. I didn't think much of that at the time. I put him in the spare room and went to bed and lay awake for an hour thinking about what I'd done, and whether I should contact the colony authority station, and whether I owed this stranger more than basic medical attention and a night's sleep before I sent him back out into whatever had put him in my barn. I fell asleep before I'd made any clear decision, which was, I suppose, its own kind of decision. He was still there in the morning. I could hear him moving carefully around the spare room when I got up. By the time I'd made tea, he was in the kitchen doorway, watching me. "You can stay," I said. "For now. If you're willing to work, I won't ask questions." He tilted his head very slightly. An old gesture that I came to understand meant, "I'm considering what you've just said and what it costs you to say it." "I need a farmhand," I said. "My previous one left. I can't manage everything alone. My hands." I stopped. I didn't explain about my hands to people. I'd explained it to the specialist, to the insurance assessor, and to no one else. I looked at the Traveler standing in my kitchen doorway, and I don't know why I kept talking except that something in the quality of his attention made it feel less like disclosure and more like record-keeping. "My hands don't always do what I tell them," I said. "Some days are better than others. I need someone who can do the physical work I can't, and I can direct it, and between us, we might hold this place together through the winter." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he walked to the kitchen table and sat down and waited for me to put a mug of tea in front of him, which I did. That was the arrangement. The first week was awkward, as first weeks are. He was willing, but he had no practical experience with farm work, which surprised me initially and then didn't. There are things you know because you've been taught them, and things you know because you've watched them, and things you've never encountered in any form. And farm work involves a very particular vocabulary of physical knowledge. How hard you can push an animal before it stops cooperating. How you read soil moisture by pressing your knuckles into a certain depth. How you coil wire so it doesn't tangle on the uncoil. How you listen to an engine to know whether it's actually running well or whether it's making a sound that means it will stop running at the worst possible moment. None of this translates to description. You have to be shown, and then you have to do it yourself enough times that it stops being a procedure and becomes instinct. He learned fast, faster than anyone I taught before, which wasn't many people, but fast enough that I noticed it. He'd watch me do something once, sometimes twice, and then do it himself with a precision that suggested he was processing every aspect of the motion and encoding it, not just copying the surface movement but understanding the underlying logic. When he made mistakes, and he made them, everyone does, he made different ones each time. He didn't repeat errors. That alone put him in a rare category of person. He had no language, but he had something like one. By the end of the first week, I could tell the difference between his focused silence and his puzzled silence and his distressed silence. By the end of the second week, I could read his gestures well enough to have something approaching a conversation, in the same way you can have a conversation with someone across a loud room by watching their face and guessing most of the words from context. We couldn't discuss abstract ideas, but we could communicate about the farm, about the animals, about the weather, about the daily negotiation of 100 small practical problems. The day he saved the South Field tractor from an engine fire was the day I started to trust him. I'd gone in to start it in the morning, and there'd been a smell, hot metal and something else, a faint chemical edge that meant something was wrong in the fuel lines. My hands were bad that day, bad enough that I was working from the wrist up and trying not to need my fingers, and I should have just walked away from the tractor and dealt with it later. Instead, I tried to open the inspection panel and dropped the wrench twice, and was working myself toward the kind of frustrated anger that makes you do something stupid. And then the traveler was there beside me. He didn't take the wrench. He looked at me and waited. I stepped back. He opened the panel, found the compromised line in about 90 seconds, and fixed it with the kind of efficiency that means you're not just solving the problem in front of you, but seeing the problem behind the problem, the thing that caused the thing. He showed me what he'd found, a microfracture in a coupling joint, almost invisible, the kind of thing that would have been a small fire in the engine bay within the hour. I nodded, he nodded back. We didn't talk about it. That was how we talked about most things. Norman noticed him eventually, of course. Norman noticed everything on or near his land, which was how he'd survived 50 years of farming in a colony that didn't make it easy. He came to the fence one afternoon while we were mending the eastern boundary wire and stood there with his arms folded, watching the traveler work. "Where's he from?" Norman said. "Don't know," I said. "What's his name?" "Don't know that either." Norman was quiet for a moment. "He speaks." "Not so far." Norman watched a while longer. The traveler was methodically resetting fence posts that had been leaning at the wrong angle for 2 seasons, doing it with the kind of steady, unhurried precision that Norman, who was a professional at steady and unhurried precision, would recognize. "He knows what he's doing," Norman said. "Getting there," I said. Norman grunted. He looked at me rather than the traveler for a moment. "You look less tired," he said, which was Norman's way of saying he was glad to see me with help, and which cost him considerable effort to say. "I sleep better when the work gets done," I said. He nodded and went back to his side of the fence. Agatha came the following Sunday, which was unusual. She normally left things at the gate. She came to the door and knocked, and when I opened it she stood there with food wrapped in cloth and her eyes going past me to the traveler, who was in the main room reading, or doing something with books that looked like reading, though I'd sometimes catch him holding a page between his fingers as if he was trying to feel the words through the paper. "I heard you had someone staying," Agatha said. "For the winter," I said. "He needed work, I needed help." She studied me for a moment. Agatha was a small woman, Anglo-Sino in her early 70s, with the kind of face that had settled into certainty over many decades of looking at the world and deciding what she thought about it. She handed me the cloth bundle. "He eats too." "He eats," I said. "Then there's enough for both," she said and left. The traveler ate his share and then looked at the empty plate for a moment, and I saw something in his face that was harder to name than hunger. Something like the recognition of an unexpected kindness, like someone who'd stopped expecting it and was quietly surprised to find it still existed. Those first weeks had a quality I've never been able to describe properly. There was the constant physical labor of keeping the farm functional with reduced capacity and winter coming. There was the management of my own condition, which was a daily negotiation between what my body could do and what I needed it to do, and what I was willing to let go of. And layered over all of that was the quiet, persistent strangeness of the traveler, the growing sense that whatever he was, it wasn't quite what I'd assumed, and that the things I was assuming weren't quite landing on the truth. Small things at first. The way he'd sometimes stop and go very still in a posture that reminded me of a sensor array rather than a man head slightly tilted, attention diffuse, as if he was processing something in a spectrum I couldn't access. He'd do it mid-task, hand halfway through a motion, foot planted at a particular angle, eyes unfocused. Then whatever he was listening for would either resolve or pass, and he'd return to himself and finish what he'd been doing, smooth as water resuming its course. I got used to it. I stopped watching him when it happened, which I think was the right thing. A person's private frequencies are their own. There was an evening in the second week when I found him standing at the window of the main room in the dark, not looking out so much as being oriented toward the sky. He had one hand flat against the glass. He didn't move when I came in, which meant he'd heard me and made a considered decision to stay as he was. I left him to it and went to bed. In the morning the window was clean, which it hadn't been the night before. He'd wiped it. I never asked why. The way animals reacted to him. Not with fear exactly, but with a focused wariness, as if they could detect something about him that didn't fit their usual categories, and they were waiting to find out what category it should be filed under. The dogs, who were not mine but who came across the boundary from Norman's land and treated the whole property as their range, avoided him for the first 4 days and then abruptly didn't. The older one, a gray-muzzled collie who'd been with Norman since before I could remember, came and sat beside the traveler one evening while he was cleaning tools on the back step, and stayed there for an hour without being invited, without being petted. Just sat, the way working dogs sit when they've decided something is acceptable. After that, the traveler was part of the established order as far as the dogs were concerned, and they reported to him in the mornings along with me. The way he healed. The mark on his neck was gone in less than a week. I'd seen fast healing before, and this wasn't that. The wound didn't scab over and fade. It resolved, as if the tissue had simply decided to be finished with the damage and moved on. I noticed it on the 6th day and didn't say anything. He noticed me noticing and also said nothing, and we went to work and the day went on. There was a system developing between us, an understanding that certain observations didn't require comment. You see a thing. You note it, you file it, and you don't make a performance of the nodding. That was the agreement. We'd never discussed it because we couldn't discuss anything in the usual sense, but it existed anyway, in the space between what was said and what was understood. I didn't ask. I wasn't ready to ask. And I think asking would have changed something between us, would have shifted the arrangement from whatever it was to a different kind of thing, and whatever it was working, and I didn't want to risk that. The hunters came on a Tuesday, in the 3rd week of October. I was in the upper field when I saw the craft descend. It didn't come in from orbit the way colony supply ships came, with the long, banked approach and the warning transmission to the nearest station. It came straight down, fast, with the arrogant trajectory of something that didn't expect interference. It landed in the field 2 kilometers north, on common land that technically belonged to the colony authority, but that nobody had used for anything in 8 years. I watched it for a long moment, then I went back to the farmhouse. The traveler was in the kitchen. He'd been chopping root vegetables for the evening meal, and when I came in the back door, he read my face and stopped. He put the knife down slowly and looked at me. I described what I'd seen, pointed north, traced a descent with my hand, showed with my fingers the size and approximate shape. He stood very still. I watched his face go through something. Not panic. It wasn't panic. It was something more like the confirmation of something he'd been expecting, a fear that had been waiting for its specific shape to arrive and was now finding it, fitting into it the way water finds the shape of whatever it fills. "The mark on your neck," I said. "That's a tracker removal, isn't it? Someone took out a tracker or put one in or—" He looked at me. "They're looking for you," I said. He looked at me. I went to the window and looked north and thought about what I knew, which wasn't much. The craft was designed for pursuit and recovery. I'd seen the model before, in colony authority newsletters about border enforcement. They were made by the Compact, the interstellar regulatory body that theoretically governed trade and movement between colony worlds and their origin systems, and they were used to bring back people who'd violated Compact law. Criminals, sometimes. Debtors, sometimes. Contract workers who'd left employment arrangements that the Compact considered legally binding. The Compact considered a great many things legally binding that ordinary people would call something different. I turned back to the traveler. "I'm not going to ask you what you did," I said. "I'm going to ask you one question, and I want you to answer it as honestly as you can." He waited. "Did you hurt anyone?" He looked at me for a long moment. Then he shook his head once, slow and deliberate, with a quality of solemnity that I'd never seen in any lie. "All right," I said. I went and bolted the front door and started thinking. The Compact officers came to the farm 2 hours later. There were 3 of them, in the gray and silver uniforms that the colony newsletters always described as standard enforcement attire, and that I'd always thought looked like they were designed specifically to make the wearer feel above the things they were walking through. 2 were human, or near enough. One was not bipedal, same rough dimensions as a person, but with a quality of movement that was wrong in small ways, a microsecond lag between decision and action that wasn't latency so much as translation, as if the being inside was running the body at a slight remove, piloting it rather than inhabiting it. The one not doing the piloting knocked on my door with 3 precise knocks, evenly spaced, not the knock of someone who expected to be told to wait. I opened it. "Jody Harrow," the lead officer said. She was human, a tall woman, dark-haired, with the flat, careful eyes of someone who'd spent years doing enforcement work and had learned to see people as categories first and individuals second. "That's me," I said. "Compact Enforcement Service. We're conducting a search operation in this sector. Are you the sole resident of this property?" "For most purposes," I said. Her eyes moved to my face. "What does that mean?" "I have seasonal help," I said. "Farmhand. He's been here 3 weeks. "Name?" "I call him the Traveler. He doesn't speak. No papers." I let a small note of exasperation into my voice, the tone of a farmer who'd taken on a drifter out of necessity and was mildly embarrassed about the informality of the arrangement. "He showed up looking for work. I needed the help." The lead officer looked at her partner, then at the non-human behind them, who was doing something I can only describe as listening with its whole body. Its attention distributed, not focused on me, but on the air around the farmhouse, on the sounds within. "We need to search the property," she said. "Do you?" I said. It's within our authority under Compact Enforcement Code. I'm aware of the Compact Code, I said. I'm also aware that the colony charter gives me the right to request that an enforcement search be conducted in the presence of a colony authority representative, which I'd like to request. The lead officer paused. That process takes approximately 6 hours. I'll wait, I said. I've got work to do in the meantime. You're welcome to stand outside. She looked at me with the expression of someone recalibrating. I wasn't what she'd expected. Whatever she'd expected, a frightened farmer, a cooperative civilian, someone who'd point them in the right direction and be glad to see them go, I wasn't it, and she was adjusting. This is an active pursuit operation, she said. The subject we're tracking poses a significant risk to. I heard the official language, I said. My answer is the same. I know my rights. Call the colony rep. I closed the door. I went to the back room where I'd put the traveler and I looked at him and I said quietly, they'll get the paperwork through eventually. They'll get access. I can slow them down by 6, maybe 8 hours. After that I can't stop them. I paused. Can you tell me what you are? Not in words, just can you show me? Is there a way? He looked at me for a long moment. Then he did something that I have tried to describe many times and have never found the right words for. He changed. Not dramatically, his face didn't shift, his body didn't alter, he didn't suddenly become unrecognizable. It was more that something that had been very carefully suppressed was briefly allowed to the surface. A quality of presence, of consciousness, that was much larger than the size of one person. Like turning on a light in a room you thought was small, and finding it much bigger than you'd imagined. I sat down on the end of the bed and looked at him. You're not from a colony world, I said. He waited. You're not from any world we know, I said. He waited. And they're not compact enforcement, I said slowly. The compact is just what they use when they're working in our space. There's something else. He nodded once, the kind of nod that means you've got there, you've got to the thing. I thought about what that meant. I thought about it for a while. Are there more of you? I said. More of whatever you are. He held his hand flat, palm down, and moved it slowly, a gesture I'd learned to read as, yes, but not nearby, I said. He adjusted the gesture slightly, not nearby, not coming. So you're alone, I said. He looked at me and said nothing, and I was sitting in a room with something ancient and strange and alone, and I found that I wasn't frightened of it. I found, and this surprised me more than anything, that I recognized the particular quality of that solitude. The one that comes from being in a situation that others couldn't quite follow and that you couldn't quite explain, and where the only available option was to hold your ground and continue. All right, I said, here's what we're going to do. What we were going to do involved several things. It involved me calling Norman on the landline. I didn't trust comms, not with a compact ship sitting 2 kilometers away running whatever surveillance they were running, and talking to him in the way we'd talked for 30 years, in the compressed, efficient language of neighboring farmers who dealt with enough trouble together to have developed shorthand. Got some officials up at the farm, I said. Enforcement type, pushing hard. I heard a craft come down, Norman said. They're looking for my farmhand, I said. Silence, the quiet one. Yes. Is he trouble? I thought about the question. I thought about the traveler learning the farm, fixing the tractor. Eating Agatha's food with that look of quiet surprise. I thought about the mark on his neck and the light I'd seen in him when he stopped suppressing it. Not to us, I said. Norman was quiet for a moment. What do you need? I need the colony rep out here tonight, I said. Which means I need someone to go to Constable Cleo and make the formal request in person, because I can't leave the farm. That's 2 hours by road, Norman said. I know, I said. I know what I'm asking. Another silence, shorter. I'll go, Norman said. Norman. I'll take Agatha. She drives faster than I do. He paused. What else? I need somewhere for someone to be, if things move faster than the paperwork does, I said. Norman understood. He didn't ask anything more. The old machinery shed, he said. East side, keys under the third post from the left. I'll tell Agatha. Thank you, I said. Don't thank me, he said. Just make sure your animals are fed. I'm not coming back to find your livestock neglected. He hung up. The next 6 hours were the most careful hours I have ever spent. I fed the animals during that time. Not because they needed feeding. I'd already done the evening round, but because moving through the yard and the outbuildings gave me a reason to be outside, a reason to look around, a reason to know where everything was. The lead officer watched me from the yard's edge during the first circuit. I ignored her in the specific way you ignore an official presence you've acknowledged and legally dealt with, not rudely, not ostentatiously, just with the flat, efficient disregard of someone who has chores to do and is doing them. I refilled water troughs that didn't need refilling. I checked gates. I listened. What I was listening for was the non-human one, the piloted body. It had moved away from the yard perimeter while the lead officer was watching me, and I'd lost track of it in the failing light, and I didn't like not knowing where it was. Its scanning, or whatever it did with those small hand movements, worried me more than the lead officer's warrant. Warrants operate in the world of paperwork and procedure. What the non-human was doing operated in a different world entirely, and I didn't know the limits of it. The compact officers, I couldn't make myself call them compact anymore, knowing what I knew, but the label would do stayed outside the farmhouse. The lead officer knocked twice more. I opened the door both times, stated that I was awaiting the colony representative, and closed it again. The third time she didn't knock. She stood at the window and looked in. I looked back at her from across the room, drinking tea, and didn't move. The non-human member of the group was the one that worried me. It stood further back than the others at the edge of the yard, and it was doing things I couldn't quite see, moving its hands in small, precise ways, pausing, adjusting. Scanning, I assumed, or something in the same family as scanning, looking for the traveler in a way that didn't require eyes. He was not in the farmhouse. I'd moved him to Norman's machinery shed 2 hours before the officers arrived, while I could still move him without being seen. The shed was 300 meters of field away, hidden by a low ridge and a stand of boundary trees. 300 meters is not far, but it was far enough for now. I'd thought about the tarpaulin for 3 of those hours. It was a thermal tarpaulin, the kind used to cover equipment through deep winter, reflective on the inside, designed to hold warmth in. I'd used it to cover the traveler in the shed. Not because I knew for certain that the non-human was doing thermal scanning, but because I didn't know that it wasn't, and the tarpaulin was what I had, and you work with what you have. That is the first principle of every kind of farming. The second thing I'd done, the thing I didn't decide so much as arrive at while standing in the shed in the hour before the officers came, was to move him again. Out of the shed and into the trees. If they got access and found the shed warm and occupied, that was the end of it. If they found the shed empty, it was only the end of one line of inquiry. I'd walked him to the pines on the north boundary, laid the tarpaulin over him in the leaf cover where the ground retained some heat of its own, and told him with the flattest and most unambiguous gesture I had, "Stay down, stay still, do not move regardless of what you hear." He'd looked at me with the particular quality of attention that means, "I understand you completely, and I will do exactly what you've said." I'd gone back to the farm. What I hadn't anticipated was what they'd do when they got impatient. It happened near midnight. I was awake. I hadn't slept, sitting in the kitchen with a lamp on low, listening. The lamp went out. The power to the farmhouse went out. Not a grid failure, the grid was solid. I knew its sounds. Something had interrupted the connection deliberately. I sat in the dark for a moment. Then I put on my coat and my boots and went to the back door and opened it quietly. The yard was very still. The stars were out, which was unusual for this part of the colony in October, and the light was enough to see by if you'd been sitting in the dark for 10 minutes, which I had. I looked toward the field. I looked toward the boundary trees. There was something moving over by the shed. Not toward it, away from it. Something fast, low, moving with a precision that human beings don't move with in the dark over rough ground. One of the non-lead officers, working the field while I was distracted by the power loss. I walked out into the yard and I said, at a carrying volume, "I know you're in my field." The movement stopped. "I have the right to be in my own field," I said, "and I am going to walk out there and check on my property. And if anyone interferes with that, I'll be adding interference with private property to the list of violations I'm reporting to the colony rep when she arrives." There was silence. Then a light went on, a hand light, held by the lead officer who'd come around the side of the house. She stood looking at me. "Mrs. Harrow." "Ms.," I said. "Ms. Harrow, I need you to understand the seriousness of—" "I understand the seriousness," I said. "I've understood it for 6 hours. What I don't understand is why you cut my power." She paused. "That was a technical error. We apologize." "Fine," I said. "Then you won't mind if I check my outbuildings while we wait for the power to come back on." She looked at me with those flat, careful eyes, and I looked back at her, and I was aware that behind me the farmhouse was dark, and the field was quiet, and somewhere in that field a man, or something that had chosen to be a man, or something that was doing the best impression of a man it could manage, was waiting. And I was standing between him and these people who were not quite compact officers, and not quite human, and not quite anything I had a good name for. My hands were shaking. They shake sometimes. That's the condition, but they shook a little less than the occasion required. "I'll go with you," the lead officer said. "That's not necessary," I said. "I insist." "Then you can walk behind me," I said. "And you can keep your colleague out of my fields, and if either of you so much as opens a door without my permission, I'll make sure every farmer in this sector knows what compact enforcement looks like when it thinks no one's watching." I walked across the yard and into the field. The lead officer followed, 3 steps behind. I could hear her footsteps in the dead grass, careful and controlled. The machinery shed was cold and dark when I opened the door. I held up my own hand light and swept it around. Rusted equipment, old fencing rolls, stacked feed containers, a tarpaulin over the bulk of what used to be a combine harvester that Norman had been meaning to get repaired for 15 years. No one. The lead officer swept her own light around, more thoroughly than I had. Her light found nothing. She stood in the middle of the shed for a moment, doing something with her attention that I couldn't quantify, like a dog working a scent it can't quite place. She found nothing. We walked back to the farmhouse. The power came back on 20 minutes later, the technical error corrected, apparently. I made more tea and sat and waited. The colony rep arrived at 2:30 in the morning. Constable Cleo was a thin woman in her 50s, who'd been administering colony authority in this sector for 14 years, and who was not happy about being woken at midnight to drive 4 hours round trip, and who was also, I had reason to know, not inclined to look favorably on compact enforcement operations that cut civilian power supplies and operated without proper notification. She examined the compact officer's documentation thoroughly. She asked questions. She took notes. She spoke to the lead officer in a tone of voice that a person uses when they want the other person to understand that they are being carefully watched. She came to me and said quietly, "They have legal authority here. There's a transit warrant issued under compact code. If the individual they're looking for is on your property." "I have a farmhand," I said. "He came here 3 weeks ago looking for work. He doesn't speak and he has no papers. I employed him informally, which I had the right to do under Colony Employment Statute 44C. If they want to interview him about his status, they can do that with you present." She looked at me. "Where is he?" "He went to check the south fences this afternoon," I said. He hasn't come back. I assume he saw the craft land and thought there was trouble and made himself scarce. He's done it before when anything official turns up. Drifters do. Cleo looked at me for a long moment. I held her gaze. There was something in her expression, a very small, very brief thing, that told me she had formed her own view of what was happening here, and that her view was not entirely different from mine. "I'll note that the subject is not present on the property," she said, "and I'll note that the enforcement team's access was appropriately delayed pending proper representation, and that no violations were found." She paused. "If your farmhand turns up, you should probably advise him to formalize his employment status." "I'll do that," I said. She went back to the lead officer, and I heard the tone of voices change. The careful, official language of an operation being wound down, a search being noted as inconclusive, next steps being discussed in the flat bureaucratic language that enforcement organizations use when they're not going to get what they came for. The compact officers left at 4 in the morning. Their craft lifted straight up fast, the same arrogant vertical it had come down in. I watched it until the lights were gone. Then I walked out into the field. He was in the trees, the small stand of boundary pines at the north edge of Norman's property, where the tarpaulin from the machinery shed had been laid over him to hold his heat signature below whatever threshold their scanning was using. I'd moved him there on my own, during the 2 hours before the officers arrived, going back to the shed after I'd left him there, removing the tarpaulin, carrying it to the trees, covering him, and then walking the empty shed for the lead officer to find. He was sitting against a tree. His eyes caught my lamp. I crouched down beside him. My knees ached. My hands were better than they'd been all day, which was something. I said, "They're gone." He looked at me. "For now," I said. "They'll file a report. They may come back. If they do, we'll deal with it then." He looked at me for a moment. Then he raised one hand, palm forward, in a gesture I hadn't seen before. New vocabulary. I tried to read it. It was, I decided, a question. The same question in a different form from the one I'd asked him in the spare room the first night. Not, "Did you hurt anyone?" but "Why this? Why all of this?" I thought about how to answer it. I thought about my grandfather and the farm and the debt and my mother's stubbornness and the specialist's gentle voice and the way my hands drop things on bad mornings and the way I keep working anyway. I thought about Agatha's food left on the gatepost with no note, and Norman's truck on a midnight road to Constable Cleo, and the way this piece of ground had been held by people who refused to let it go. "You asked for nothing," I said. "You showed up in my barn and you didn't ask for anything. You just needed somewhere to be that wasn't where you'd been." He watched me. "I know something about that," I said. He was quiet for a moment, then he lowered his hand. "He stayed through the winter." I won't pretend the threat was over. It wasn't. The compact officers filed their inconclusive report and moved on to other searches, but the organization behind them, the thing using the compact as its instrument, doesn't close files. It waits. It has the patience of something that doesn't die on any schedule we would recognize. I thought about that sometimes in the weeks after. The difference between a patience born from having time, more time than we can easily measure, and a patience born from having decided something was worth waiting for. They weren't waiting because they'd forgotten. They were waiting because they believed they'd get another chance, and that when they did, the situation would have deteriorated. The woman would have fewer resources, less fight, less ability to hold what she was holding. They were making a calculation about diminishing returns. They'd made it about the wrong person. But it had not, that night, been quite patient enough. It had moved too fast and assumed too much. It had looked at a farm and a sick woman and decided there was nothing there to trouble it, and it had been wrong. By November, the traveler could run the farm's daily operations with minimal direction from me. He'd become something more than a farmhand, though I'd be hard-pressed to name what he'd become. He knew which animals were off their feed and why. He knew the Southfield's drainage problem and how to work around it until I could afford to fix it properly. He knew how I took my tea, and he made it without asking when my hands were bad. There was a day in late November when I woke up and couldn't stand properly. The vertigo had come in hard overnight, and the room didn't agree with itself about which way the floor was. I sat on the edge of the bed and put my feet flat on the planks and waited for the world to decide. The traveler appeared in the doorway. He looked at me, looked at the room, made a careful assessment of the situation. He brought me water and the specific medication from the shelf where I kept it, which he'd never been shown but had apparently cataloged at some point in the last 2 months. He didn't hover. He left them within reach and went to start the morning work, and I heard the yard sounds shifting in their sequence as he moved through the routines that had become shared property between us. By mid-morning, I was functional enough to get to the kitchen. He was already back in, washing his hands at the sink, and he glanced at me with the question that wasn't a question. "Are you all right enough to leave alone?" And I nodded, and he went back out. That was the winter. That was how it ran. Not dramatic, not easy, not the story people want when they ask about it. Just the farm and the work and two people who'd arrived at an understanding that went past language because it had to. Norman stopped pretending not to know what was happening and started pretending something subtly different. That he'd known all along and simply not commented because it wasn't his business, which was more or less the same thing dressed in different clothes. He and the traveler worked the east boundary fence together one afternoon, and I watched from the window, and there was a quality to the silence between them that was recognizably the silence between two people who are communicating in the way that people who work alongside each other do, through the pace of work, through the angle of attention, through the shared economy of doing a job and doing it right. When I came out and asked Norman how the fence was, he said, "It's done." "Good," I said. He looked at me. "You're going to have company again," he said. "Agatha wants to have Christmas at ours, the three of you." I looked at the traveler, who was coiling wire with precise, unhurried efficiency. I thought about what it would mean to him, sitting at Norman and Agatha's table at Christmas, in this cold, flat corner of a colony whirled a long way from wherever he'd come from. A world that had not made it particularly easy for him to be here, that was not precisely welcoming, that harbored in its administrative structures and enforcement frameworks a mechanism actively trying to recover him. He looked up and caught me looking. He raised an eyebrow very slightly, another piece of vocabulary I'd acquired recently. This one meant, "What are you going to say?" "Tell Agatha yes," I said to Norman. He nodded and walked back to his land. I stood in my yard in the cold and looked at the empty northern sky where the craft had been. Then I went inside. The winter came hard that year, as it usually did. The temperature dropped below what the weather systems normally permitted, and there were 3 weeks when we couldn't get a supply vehicle through the southern track, and we ran the farm on what we had and we managed. Christmas at Norman and Agatha's was a quiet thing. 3 people and a table and food that Agatha had put real effort into, and outside the windows the dark of a colony winter pressing in from every direction. Norman produced a bottle of something he'd been holding for years and hadn't found the occasion to open, which told me more about how he felt about the year than anything he said directly. Agatha had made a point of setting a proper place for the traveler with the same care she'd applied to ours, which was a small thing that was not a small thing at all. He sat at the table and he looked at the plates and the candles and the 3 other people who had, by various routes and varieties of stubbornness, decided to be in the same room with him, and his face did that thing again, the thing I'd first seen when he looked at his empty plate after Agatha's first bundle of food. The surprised recognition of an unexpected kindness, still surprised by it, still not quite believing it was simply offered, with no ledger to settle afterward. Norman didn't make a toast. He was not a man who made toasts. He poured the glasses and set the bottle down and looked at the table for a moment, and then he said, "Good year's work." That was all. He picked up his glass. We picked up ours. I've thought about those 3 words often. Good year's work. It was technically inaccurate. The year had not been good in any standard agricultural accounting of profit and loss. Piotr had left, the enforcement operation had happened. My condition had advanced in the ways it advances whether you cooperate with it or not. By most measures the year was something you describe with words other than good. But good year's work, the work done, the ground held, everyone at the table. There were mornings when I couldn't do much at all, when the cascade was bad enough that I sat at the kitchen table and watched the yard while the traveler worked, and he would come in at midday and sit across from me and eat whatever I'd been able to make, and we'd sit in silence, and the silence wasn't the silence of two people with nothing to say. It was the silence of two people who'd been through something together and knew the worth of each other, and didn't need to annotate it. I've thought about what it was that made it work, the two of us on that farm through that winter. I've thought about what quality it required, in both of us, to hold the arrangement against the pressure that was being applied from outside. What I come back to is stubbornness, not the romantic kind, not the kind that makes a good speech, the plain kind, the kind that says, this is mine and this is right and you don't get it. Whatever the hunters were, they had patience and resources and authority, and the full weight of an interstellar regulatory apparatus behind them. What they didn't have was any real understanding of what they were dealing with. They'd looked at a woman with a degenerative condition trying to hold together an isolated farm, and they'd seen something that wouldn't be much trouble. They'd made their assessment, and their assessment was wrong, and the specific way it was wrong is worth nomming. They'd looked at someone who was struggling and decided that struggling meant diminishing, that a person who was losing something was therefore less than they'd been. They'd never learned, apparently, that the thing you learn when something is being taken from you, your health, your security, your certainty about what the next year holds, is exactly how much you're willing to fight to keep what's left. They'd never had to learn it. That's the difference. That's always the difference. There's a line I've come back to often, in the time since. The traveler taught it to me, in his way, without language, in the way that the understanding of a thing can be transmitted by two people sitting in a kitchen at the end of a hard day, too tired to pretend about anything. He'd come a long way looking for somewhere that wasn't trying to reclaim him. He'd found a farm that barely had enough to keep itself going, run by a woman whose hands didn't always work, in a corner of a colony world that the capital had quietly decided wasn't worth prioritizing. And it had been enough, not comfortable, not safe, not easy, but enough. I think about that on the mornings when the cascade is bad and I'm sitting at the table watching the yard and trying to decide if I have it in me for the day. I think about him in the barn, lying in the straw with his eyes open, and the decision I made when I didn't press the emergency contact. I think about what it took from him to trust that decision, and what it took from me to earn that trust, and how the two of us together on that ground were harder to move than either one of us alone would have been. Spring came. The southern track cleared. I got my supply delivery and a water pump that needed replacing and a letter from the colony authority confirming that the compact enforcement matter had been administratively closed, subject to review, which is the language they use when they don't have enough to proceed and don't want to admit it. I read the letter twice. Subject to review. That phrase did what it was designed to do, which was leave a door open. I filed the letter in the farm paperwork where I filed everything official between the land title and the equipment warranties, and I thought about what it meant. It meant they hadn't given up. It meant someone, somewhere in whatever structure the hunters used, had noted the farm on a list and the farm was staying on the list. The closure was administrative, not absolute. The hunters were patient. I'd established that in October, and I wasn't going to mistake a season of quiet for an end to the matter. But I'd also established something else in October. I'd established that I could work with what I had. 6 hours of waiting, a phone call to Norman, a tarpaulin, and a thorough knowledge of my own land in the dark. Those were the tools I'd used, and they'd been sufficient. The hunters had all their apparatus and their warrants and their non-human scanner and their arrogant vertical descent, and I'd had a tarpaulin and 30 years of knowing which way the ground ran at night, and it had been enough. That was good to know. You always want to know what's enough. The traveler read the letter. He put it down on the table and looked at me. I poured 2 mugs of tea and sat down across from him. "You can stay as long as you need," I said. He looked at the letter and then at me and then out the window at the fields, which were showing the first pale green of the spring growth, and the sky above them, which was still gray but a different gray than winter, lighter, with the suggestion of something behind it. He picked up his mug. I picked up mine. We sat there in the morning quiet, and the farm held us both.